the volume which has been...
Now okay, sir. Okay.
Now I'm loud and clear.
Now clear.
Okay. So what I propose to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to examine or review the current crisis in the asylum regime in the global north. Because globalization, migration, refugees is a very, very vast topic. So at best what one can look at is a fragment of that topic. And the fragment that I've chosen to address is the crisis in the asylum regime in the global north, which was most sort of poignantly captured, as you would all recall, by the lifeless, tragic figure of Aylan Kurdi, lying on a beach in Turkey. He died as he tried to escape with his family in a very shaky boat to Greece. But the family never made it to Greece, and young Aylan Kurdi met a very, very cold death in the Mediterranean Sea. Now I wish to proceed in the following manner in order to address this crisis. First, I'll try and look at two of the principal causes of the asylum crisis. Then I'll try and look at, in some detail in this case, at the impact that these causes have had on the asylum regime in the global north, especially in Europe. How it has led to the reconfiguration or the restructuring of the traditional asylum regime that prevailed in Europe between 1945, especially 1950, and 1989. But before I look at that, I will try and clarify for you certain categories of migrants, along with the definition of a refugee, which we need to know if we are going to discuss the global asylum crisis. I will then also, prior to looking at the legal and institutional structures in Europe, also talk about the human condition of refugees. Often when we discuss the legal and institutional regimes, we discuss causes. We get a very reified picture of the problem of refugees. But we need to very, very sort of intimately understand what is the life world of refugees. What are the kind of conditions that they have to confront in their everyday quotidian life, and the ways in which they come to terms with it. So let me then turn first to the two major causes of the current asylum crisis in the global north. The first is a political cause. And these political causes are twofold. First, the major cause of the asylum crisis lies in the end of the Cold War. As every student of refugee law or refugee regimes knows, that the refugee regime that prevailed in Europe and created after the Second World War was complicit in the Cold War. That is, the refugee regime was at least in part established to fight the Cold War against the Soviet Union and its allies. Because every refugee that fled from the Soviet Union and its allied countries, or the Soviet bloc countries, voted in a sense with his or her feet against the socialist regime. So the refugee regime was used essentially to embarrass the Soviet Union and its allies. But with the end of the Cold War, the very rationale for the refugee regime which prevailed in the Second World War, in a sense, disappeared. That if it is correct to assume that the refugee regime created in the post-Second World War period was a response to the Cold War, then the fact that the Cold War ended also meant that the reason why this regime was established also disappeared. Now we know that the core of the regime that was created in the post-Second World War period was around a major convention or treaty known as the 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, which defines the refugees, talks about the rights of refugees, etc. Now, we will see in detail later on how after the Cold War, this regime was sought to be undermined by countries in the global north. The second sort of political dimension or cause of the crisis has been that in the post-Cold War era, once the Soviet Union or the Second World disappeared, the first world countries or the once capitalist countries started to more actively intervene in third world countries. And this began immediately after the end of the Cold War and is often given the name of humanitarian intervention, or more recently, the category responsibility to protect is used. And as you would recall, that immediately after the end of the Cold War, the process began. First, the NATO countries went into Iraq in 1991, followed by Kosovo in 1999, followed by Iraq again in 2003, followed by Afghanistan, followed by Libya, followed by Syria. And when I come to discussing the refugees, you won't be surprised, I'm quite certain, if you find that preponderantly of the number of global refugees come from precisely these countries. So now you had this inner tension in the changed political scenario. And what was this inner tension? That on one hand, the rationale for the refugee, for a liberal refugee regime disappeared. The liberal refugee regime, which was most welcoming of refugees from the Soviet Union, because this was, as I said, used as a weapon against in the struggle of the Cold War. So on one hand, this regime was undermined, but on the other hand, because of the active intervention of the Western world or the global north into third world countries, it ended up generating larger and larger number of refugees, millions of refugees. And it is this, partly this tension that you are coming to see play out today in terms of the crisis or the asylum crisis in Europe. The second big cause is, I would say, the economic crisis in the global north. Now, at its heart, it reflects the contradiction between an expanding neoliberal globalization process and the prevalent Westphalian system. That is, on one hand, you have expanding capitalism, which is neoliberal capitalism, which is disruptive of growth in much of the world. And on the other hand, the Westphalian system is constructed in a manner that states assert their sovereignty most when it comes to their borders. In other words, if we believe that the current globalization process is an unjust one not only for the global south but also for peoples of the global north, where jobless growth has been followed by serious economic crisis since 2007, And this serious serious crisis, even in the global north, has meant fanning the flames of xenophobia, giving vent to encouraging racist ideologies, which you can see manifest in the rise of neo-Nazi parties or extreme right-wing parties, the Marine Le Pen's in France, or the neo-Nazi parties in Germany, and extreme right-wing all over Europe. And this has again led to a situation where the political leadership in the global north, especially in Europe, is unable to pursue liberal policies of asylum, leading to the crisis in the asylum, system. Now, before I come to how this crisis manifests itself, I think it's very important to know how this crisis manifests itself. How has this crisis played itself out in the post-Cold War era? We need to understand the details of this. But before I come to that, I need to say a few words about the different categories that we are discussing, and also briefly the definition of a refugee. Because when we are discussing a refugee, we need to know who a refugee is. First, the categories. We know, there are two kinds of migrants. One are forced migrants, and the other are voluntary migrants. What I am talking about are forced migrants. The forced migrants are again of two kinds. One, the internally displaced persons, as we have hundreds of thousands in India itself. And then there are the refugees. And within voluntary migrants, we have different kinds. We have legal migrants, we have irregular migrants. Now, what I am addressing is essentially the world of refugees, one category of forced migrants. The refugees have been defined in the 1951 UN Convention on the Status of Refugees, and this definition is very, very widely accepted. It's universally accepted. And the entire states of the global north are parties to this 1951 convention. India is not. The definition of a refugee that the 1951 convention offers has sort of three elements. The first of is that a refugee is a person who has well-founded fear of being persecuted, or well-founded fear of being persecuted. That is the first element. The second element is that this well-founded of fear of being persecuted must have a nexus with 5 different categories. That is, it must relate to religion, nationality, race, membership of a particular social group, or holding a particular political opinion. And third, this individual must be outside the country of origin. You cannot be a refugee unless you cross an international border. As I tell my students, the print media at home often uses the word refugees as a substitute for what we call internally displaced persons. Now these are refugees. Now, why did I speak about the need to understand these categories? The need to understand these categories flows from the fact that today in Europe, the entire refugee crisis is thought to be presented as a migration crisis. That is, refugees are essentially depicted or portrayed as economic migrants. When they use the word migrants, so you have to be very alert here to the politics of language. The politics of language is important because there is a quick shift in the obligation that states owe to an individual, whether you classify this person as a refugee or whether you classify this person as a migrant. That makes a world of a difference. So that is why the media in Europe has been trying to portray this 1 million people who are said to have reached the shores of Europe as being migrants. Whereas it's very, very clear that the preponderant number of these migrants, of these individuals, are actually refugees. And that takes me back to the source countries. The 1 million, they have been broken up into the countries from into groups in terms of the countries from which they have fled. And the top 4 countries from which these people have come are Iraq, Syria, Libya and Afghanistan, clearly showing that these are individuals who have fled conflict. These are individuals who have fled threats to their life or freedom, and these are not economic migrants. And I think there is a need to deconstruct the sort of disinformation that is being disseminated by the popular media in Europe. Now, having said this, I'll just spend another few moments before I go on to talk about the legal and institutional changes brought about in the post-Cold War era, about the human condition of refugees. I think we often do not attach sufficient significance or do not pay sufficient attention to the world that refugees have to confront. You must imagine these are people who have fled their own nation, who have fled their own country, because their country is persecuting them, their country is unwilling to defend them. And they have gone to another country where they are viewed as often as with suspicion, often as a burden, often as people who are unwelcome. So these are essentially, in the substantial sense, not in the legal sense, stateless people. They are essentially stateless people. And therefore, because they are stateless, there is no individual in either society, their home state or the host state, to take up their cause. So they have to constantly speak for themselves. It is to capture this situation that Hannah Arendt, the famous 20th century philosopher, used the term the rights to have rights. She expressed the view that these are people who do not have the right to have rights. So first they must be treated as human before they can be granted rights. And the view of most states prior to the Cold War was that these were not people with rights. In much of the first half of the 20th century, the Western states, in particularly the United States, was most unwelcoming of refugees. In fact, between 1933 and 1945, when there was the maximum amount of persecution in Nazi Germany, the United States had the most restrictive regimes. And this has been captured in a well-known journey which 937 refugees undertook in a ship called St. Louis from Germany, first to Cuba to be rejected, and then to Florida in the United States to be turned back by the US Coast Guards. And the statements of people who were on board the St. Louis is very, very heartbreaking, because they felt, what kind of people are we? Are we vermin in order for every country in the world to be rejecting us, and they had to return to Europe, and some of them had to go to Belgium and France and were immediately caught in the onslaught of Hitler and were sent off to, many of them were sent off to concentration camps. So the world of refugees is a very, very difficult world. And I thought I'll try and capture it for you, and I promised some of my students to read out a short poem. This is written by W.H. Auden. I have many here. I have the poetry of Bertolt Brecht. I have Auden. But the Auden poem is a very simple one. And I'll just read out 3-4 stanzas from this poem, when he describes the sort of situation of refugee. As you know, he was an Anglo-American poet. And the poem is called Refugee Blues. And so this is how I'm not reading out all the stanzas, I'll read out 4 or 5 stanzas for you. And Auden writes, "Say, this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there is no place for us, my dear, yet there is no place for us, is addressing his spouse. Once we had a country and we thought it fair, look at the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard, there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, if you have got no passport, you are officially dead. But we are still alive, my dear. But we are still alive. Went to a committee. They offered me a chair. Asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? Where shall we go today? I dreamed. I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. And so he was expressing, he was trying to capture in the poem the life world of a refugee. And we should not be alien to this sentiment, although technically partition refugees were not refugees because they were given citizenship on both sides. But we know the travails. I come from the part of the country where my parents, my grandparents talked to me about the kind of problems refugees faced. And so we are familiar with the kind they are faced. And therefore, when we look at the kind of asylum system that is being built in Europe, we must keep in mind the human condition of these refugees. We must keep in mind also other groups of refugees. That Palestinian child who's a 5th generation refugee in a camp. So it's ironic, two of the examples, one Jewish refugee is being rejected in the Second World War at the height of persecution by Nazi Germany, and then there are the Palestinian refugees in camps in for the fifth generation. So please bear these in mind when you think about and analyze the global asylum regime, because otherwise we have a reified, idea of what this regime is and what it is expected to do. And like I said, Alan Kurdi somehow shook the world. He shook the conscience of the world. This 3-year-old Syrian child. Why did he have to meet his death drowning in the Mediterranean? There's no reason for this. With that, let me now go on to discuss some details about the kind of asylum regime Europe has constructed in the post-Cold War period. And this construction doesn't date from 6 months ago or 1 year ago. This began even as the Cold War was wounding up. Because by this time, and that was the principle, by this time, instead of there being white, male, anti-communist refugees coming from the Soviet bloc countries, and I put it starkly to you, these were third world asylum seekers who were landing now in the doors of Europe. And Europeans were not interested in giving safe haven to these refugees. But I need to say one more thing before turning to the asylum regime that's been constructed here. I often go to Oxford every other summer to speak to the summer school there held by the Oxford Refugee Studies Center, to which essentially large numbers of people from the global north come. And when I tell them this figure, which they know, and which is almost a platitudinous figure, literally, it shakes them. So I said, before we discuss your regime and the numbers that are involved, 1 million, remember that between 1846 and 1939, 59 million Europeans left the shores of Europe and formed settler colonies abroad. So they have been going since the 16th century, but even in the short period, 59 million Europeans went abroad. And this 59 million is out of a population which was half the size of today's population. wasn't 6 billion then. So you're talking of a large percentage of Europe leaving. And for, reasons that they would not want to leave, but they had to leave. But you have to keep this historical fact. The suggestion here is not that therefore you have to now admit 59 million people. That's not the suggestion at all. The suggestion is that you still have control over your borders so far as economic migrants are concerned. You were economic migrants, large numbers. But at least in case of those who are fleeing their threats to the life of freedom, at least allow them in, because you are under a legal obligation to do so under the 1951 Convention. Now let me speak to you briefly about this regime in Europe. Now there have been what they call two generations of legal and administrative measures. Two generations of legal and administrative measures which have been taken in order to restrict the movement of refugees coming from the third world countries into global north. Let me first list out the first generation measures, which the students would be familiar with. But those who are not, I think it needs to be listed out for them. And these are, first, visas. Second, carrier sanctions. Third, interdiction on the high seas. Fourth, creation of international zones. Fifth, restrictive definition of the interpretation of a refugee. Seventh, deterrence measures, that even if you still make it inside, there may be mandatory detention, there may be no family reunification, there may be no job or right to work. These are known as the first generation measures. Now let's see, just look at 2 or 3 of them to see how it will work. First, visas. Now just imagine this conflict going on in Syria, in Libya, or earlier in Kosovo, in Bosnia. Genocide was taking place. Now what is a person supposed to do? Where is he supposed to queue up? In front of which embassy to ask for a visa? Saying that now I'm going to your country to seek asylum. If it wasn't so cruel, there would be a lighter side to visas. And I think present generation doesn't know, maybe the Vice Chancellor and Ajay would know that when we first went to Britain, we did not need visas. As Commonwealth citizens, I remember walking in with my Indian passport into Britain. Now there are visas. And if you look at the visa forms for some countries, especially the Schengen countries in Europe, you might sometimes find a star there saying that you promise never to seek asylum in any of these countries. So this is visa. But the next one is even more interesting. That is carrier sanctions. Now what does carrier sanctions mean? The carrier sanction means what it actually means on the face of it. That if any commercial carrier carries one person, individual from one country to another country without proper papers, that is with visas, etc., etc., then that commercial airline can be fined very heavily, and in some cases even the aircraft compounded. And why is this being done? To shift the burden of the keeping these measures in place from the state to avoid the stigma onto a commercial carrier. And like I said to my students, just imagine if you catch a bus from JNU to go to Connaught Place, and the conductor inside asks you, where are you going? Why are you going? Have you got sufficient money to go to Connaught Place? And you will say, this is none of your business. Where I go, I might just catch the next bus and come back. But the KLM, Air India, Swiss Air, these are exactly commercial airlines. You buy a ticket and they are supposed to take you wherever you are supposed to go. They are not immigration officers. Yet every time I go to check in, they ask me, show me your visa papers. And I often ask them, since now I am in an age group where I actually wouldn't mind being sent back. I hate to travel. And so I often ask them, why are you asking me? Who are you to ask me this question? You're a commercial airline. Take your ticket. When I go to immigration, that man has got the right to ask me. But this entire burden has been shifted onto commercial airlines. The third kind, and I won't go on, the third is interdiction on the high seas. And the classic example of this is the US. The US Coast Guards have been instructed since the time of President Bush Sr. that you won't allow any refugees from Haiti, just across, to come into the coastal waters of United States. And I have followed that every subsequent candidate for presidency, I'm sure it will be this time around also, although it's difficult to predict with Donald Trump what he might say. But every president thereafter said, if I become the president of the United States, I will withdraw this directive to the US Coast Guards. This is what Bill Clinton said, this is what Bush Jr. said, etc. It still remains in place. And what does it do? As soon as the boats are about to enter into the territorial waters of, that is 12 nautical miles of United States, then you are on the territory of US. The safeguards of US Constitution take over. The civil society within the United States, the NGOs working for asylum seekers, they come into the picture. So they return it back. Now, returning back, and I don't want to get into this detail, is a clear violation of international legal obligation under the UN Convention on Status of Refugees, which is known as the principle of non-refoulement. That is, you will not send back any person to the territory where his or her life of freedom is in danger. But they actually did that. This case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees submitted an amicus curiae to the US Supreme Court saying, but this doesn't make sense. If you don't let them in, then aren't you violating this principle that you should not be pushing them back? And what is the point of your undertaking this legal obligation if they can never step into your territory? And the US Supreme Court upheld this. And so on. I can go on. I can spend the next couple of hours narrating to you the specific measures that they have taken. But at least two I must mention more. One is known as the Pacific Solution, which has all the connotations that. This Pacific, because we have ignored that side of the world. The Pacific Solution came from Australia. And the Pacific Solution was twofold. One, don't allow the refugees anywhere near your territory. Now this territory for a long time meant also, and still means officially, meant vis-a-vis asylum seekers also meant the 3,000 odd islands. And if you could reach one of these islands, you were supposed to be on the territory of Australia. So basically what Australia did is to say, as for this purpose, we excise these 3,000. So you can keep going there, but that doesn't mean you're on the territory of of Australia. And then they started sending a lot of people to the island of Nauru in the Pacific in order for their asylum claims to be processed, with the promise that we will give you some free aid and we will also in the future give you some amount of help to your students, etc. etc. Now this Pacific Solution and these other measures, in the recent past, many of these have been struck down by the courts. In the European Union by the European Court, in Australia by the High Court, which is their Supreme Court of India, their Supreme Court in terms of hierarchy of ours. And so the Global North was concerned that some of these measures are coming to be legally challenged. That we can't create international zones in airport. They have created an international zone in airport where you could just go. Where if you landed and sought asylum, suppose you somehow managed, then they will put you in the international zone and say this international zone is actually not part of the territory of X. Again, the European Court looked at in disdain at this and struck down. But with these measures in place, they were substantially able to reduce substantially the number of applications which were coming into Europe. From some, in the peak of about, in 1988, from about 700 to 800,000 applications, they brought it down to 4,000 or 5,000 or 500,000 applicants. But meanwhile, this crisis, the other crisis began. It has just peaked with this 1 million, but other crises have already begun. Libya, Syria, etc. had begun. Now, meanwhile, remember that most of the refugees fleeing from these countries are located in the developing world, or at least in the non-Western world. So the most number of refugees are, Syrian refugees are where? They are in Turkey. So 85% of the global refugees are located in the poor world, partly because of geographical proximity, partly because these non-entry measures which do not allow you to reach the shores of Europe, etc. But meanwhile, in human ingenuity, the biggest or the fastest growing industry in the world came into existence. And that fastest growing industry in the world is the smuggling and trafficking industry. Because as soon as they found all other avenues blocked, refugees and also some economic migrants, they turned to smugglers. They said, okay, we'll give you $10,000, you get us to X, we'll give you so much, you get us to Y, etc., etc. A story that we are familiar with. So two kinds of strategies then came into existence. Let me put this quickly. One strategy was to somehow attack the smuggling and trafficking industry without opening up legal channels. Without opening up legal channels. And one of the reasons that trafficking is such a big issue in the third world countries is because the global north has made it a big issue. Because they want to stop people using certain channels for movement from one country to another. Now they came up with a second set of measures, and this second set of measures, for lack of time, I won't get into details. But here are some measures. One, bilateral agreements. For example, Germany has a bilateral agreement with Poland saying that we will give you so much assistance, we will give you all this technology, including night goggles. Can you patrol the borders for us? And of course, in order to become member of the European Union, they had to sign on to what is known as the EU Acquis, which meant that they had to, before they could become a member, sign on to the 1951 Convention on Status of Refugees. So you sign up bilateral agreements. This is with neighboring countries in Europe. Second thing they started doing was sign up bilateral agreements with countries in Africa. Italy and Spain actually promised $5 billion to Gaddafi. Can you put up a radar there somewhere in Libya so that you can stop people? Can you patrol it for us so that the Mediterranean is not used? So this was another kind of measure. Third was development aid. That we will give you all this development aid if you assist us in fighting the movement of refugees and migrants. A fourth measure they started now taking was to place their own immigration officers in third countries. So you will now have American immigration officers in Thailand, in Bangkok airport, who will decide whether this person, whether he has a visa or not. As you know, visa is not a right to enter any country. It's not a right. They can stop you even when you are there. But so now you have immigration officers of that country located in the airport of another country deciding whether this person can leave or not. Whether he's an asylum seeker, she's an asylum seeker or not. And decide. So a whole range of measures, new measures, because the old was being challenged, have been put in place in order to stop the movement. But the fact remains that 1 million refugees have reached, or so I am told. I don't know. We have experts here in European studies will tell us whether it is 1 million or not. But it isn't a dramatic figure. There are about 20 million refugees in the world. And 20 million was 2 years ago. So my estimate is about 23 to 25 million refugees in the world. All the rest are in the developing world, and some of them in the poorest countries of the world. And they are being good hosts to refugees. We ourselves have 350,000 refugees. It's not huge by the standards of our population size, but India has not been complaining that we have received this number of refugees. So, 2 points I want to make. One, all these measures have actually led to this crisis because all the legal channels of movement have been stopped and people have no other way of reaching a European country. So if Ireland Kurdi has met this fate, it is because he doesn't simply have a legal channel through which he can move and reach another country. So what can be done? That's a huge, big question. But let me quickly say at least a few things which I won't detail out. One, of course, follows from this last point that legal channels have to be opened up. And these are not radical suggestions. Most of the suggestions I'm going to offer to you now have been made by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, an organization which is more or less funded by the Western world. But they are standing up for refugee rights to their credit, despite being owing their existence to funding, voluntary funding coming from the Western world. So one is open up channels, legal channels. If there are no legal channels, then there will be smuggling, there will be trafficking. People will use all kinds of means to get there. And this would be hazardous for those. There are almost 3,000 people who have died in the Mediterranean trying to get to the first world. So that is one measure that needs to be taken. Second is, especially to countries like Greece, open up places where refugees can be welcomed and put procedures in place for the processing of the application of asylum seekers. A third thing is scrupulously respect the principle of non-refoulement, which is the core principle of what they call international refugee law, or the core humanist principle. Now that principle, as we are talking, is being violated through the agreement that EU has arrived with Turkey, which allows Greece to send back Syrian refugees and other refugees. In fact, the first lot I read was from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Be sent back to Turkey, which will receive them, and then in exchange for that, they may take in a Syrian refugee. Now, this is in clear violation. Both the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as those international NGOs have categorically said that this violates human rights law and refugee law, and violates it starkly. So that needs to be. Fourth is to create an international responsibility sharing regime, international burden sharing regime, both within Europe, through completing the creation of, which is half complete, the European asylum regime, and also through sharing the burden of refugees in the rest of the developing world, in the rest of the third world. Because again, if you look at the power of the media, we of course see it nationally also. It's not lost on us, the power of the media. But look at the international media, it's never so concerned. Even about poor Turkey. Is it concerned about Jordan with all the Palestinian refugees? Have you seen a program somewhere which says 1 million refugees have come? Now what will happen to poor Jordan? No. Not much was written even when we had 10 million refugees coming from Bangladesh. This is the pre-electronic media days. So there must be some amount of burden shared. So I can go on with this list of possible measures that need to be taken. But I think I've already taken enough time. So let me conclude by saying that one, we need to carefully study the events in Europe. We need to be deconstructing all the information that is brought to us by their mainstream media, which often obfuscates reality, and try to place the position of the global south, but above all, try and place the situation of hapless refugees who have lost one home and not gained another one. Somebody has to speak for them, and it is part of our obligation that we speak for people for whom nobody else is willing to speak. There aren't a country who will speak for them. There are no groups speaking for them, and we need to somehow speak for them. And I think this is an obligation of conscience that we need to speak for refugees. I'll conclude with at least one remark in all fairness that I want to make. That while all these restrictive regimes are in place, to the credit of the European nations and all nations in the global north, they have never reneged from their promise under the 1951 Convention. They have never said, the Cold War has ended, we no longer want to be party to the 1951 Convention status of refugees, or we no longer feel we are under a moral obligation to give refuge, give safe haven to asylum seekers. To their credit, as liberal democratic states, they have not basically rejected this core humanitarian principle. Yet, they have made a large amount of efforts at a time when ideas, goods, services, everything is mobile. To render the human body immobile. Everything else is mobile. Ideas move at the speed of light. Anything published, within a second you can access it. Goods move, services move, capital, we are dying to get it to move. Every day we say we'll take 10 other measures. Can you come home? Yet the only thing that can't move are human beings. And again, we are duty bound to ensure that as students of international relations, we're just ordinary citizens, we're just humans. And we argue the case for hapless people like asylum seekers. Thank you very much.